Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a place where snow never melts and silence hides more than it reveals. Imagine this: the wind cuts like knives, carrying with it the faint copper tang of blood. Though no wound is visible on the surface of the white drifts, you step into a clearing, lantern trembling in your frozen hand. And there, half buried in snow, you see the first sign that nothing here is as it seems. Before you dive deeper into this chilling truth, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with the time and place you're watching, so I know you're still out there. And we'll dive into tonight's journey together. The man's body lies twisted near the timber sled, his face frozen in an expression between shock and terror. His open eyes are glazed with frost, his lips cracked and drawn back, as if his last breath had frozen in his throat. Blood stains the snow, not in a single pool, but in scattered streaks, as though someone had dragged him deliberately, arranging the scene to tell a story of accident. Yet the story does not fit. His hands are missing their gloves, his boots, laced tight the night before, are gone. Around his body, the snow shows the faint indentations of others' footprints, half erased by wind. You lean closer, squinting through the storm's veil, and notice that his arms have been positioned unnaturally, laid flat against his sides like a soldier in his coffin. His chest is bare where the coat has been cut open, fabric edges curled and stiff with ice. And then, as the lantern flame flickers, you see the snow stained deeper beneath his ribs, a cavity hollowed out with surgical precision. The air tastes metallic, sharp, invasive. This was no accident, no slip of an axe, no fall from timber. This was hunger wearing the mask of winter. The memory of that first body haunts you as you recall how the journey to White Peak Camp began. It was the winter of 1893, when the northern mountains seemed endless and suffocating in their silence. 87 men marched through knee-deep snow, tools strapped to their backs, their breath rising like ghosts into the frozen air. You were among them, carrying not just provisions, but a strange sense of foreboding, a whisper that the forest itself did not want you there. At the front of the column walked Arlen Krauss, the camp's foreman. His fur-lined coat brushed the snow, and his eyes scanned the horizon with a coldness sharper than the wind itself. He was not a man who spoke much. When he did, his words were clipped, stripped of warmth. Whispers among the men said Krauss had overseen other camps before, each one marked by accidents, disappearances, and silence written into the final reports. Yet here he was again, leading you all deeper into the white void. Trailing behind him, like a shadow, was Jorvik Madsen, the cook. His leather apron was smeared from years of kitchen work, but his knives gleamed as though they were never put down. Madsen had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes, and when he sharpened his blades by the fire at night, the sound carried like a rasping lullaby into the men's restless sleep. The camp itself was nothing but rows of timber huts, pitched against the roaring wind, their roofs heavy with snow Smoke rose in thin threads from the chimneys, a fragile defiance against the weight of the sky. Inside, men gathered around the iron stoves, boots steaming, hands trembling as they gnawed on stale bread and salted pork. Yet even in those moments of supposed warmth, a tension coiled beneath every laugh, every muttered story. It was not long before signs began to unsettle you. The first were the animals elk and wolves found strung upside down in the trees near camp, gutted clean, as though displayed for someone's inspection. Men muttered that it was the work of rivals or of poachers, but their voices never carried conviction. Then there was the food. Barrels of grain and sacks of flour seemed to vanish at an unnatural pace. Though rations were carefully counted, the ledgers Krauss kept were neat, precise, yet you could see the truth in the hollow faces of the men. Some of them began to question openly. A logger named Henrik swore he had seen Krauss himself adjusting the tallies by lantern light, erasing marks, adding others. Another claimed he had caught Madsen slipping into the supply shed at night, his apron still tied, his hands gloved, though the fire in the cookhouse was still warm. These were whispers, quickly silenced when Krauss passed by. His gaze alone could cut short the boldest tongue. Nights were the worst. The storm wind screamed against the wooden walls, and in the dark, the forest creaked as if alive. Some swore they heard footsteps circling the cabins, crunching snow where no patrol was meant to be. Others whispered about shadows moving between the trees, too tall, too slow, to be human. The older men began marking their doors with charcoal crosses, old superstitions from villages far away, though no one admitted it by daylight. But what struck you most was the silence between Krauss and Madsen. They rarely spoke to each other in public, but when their eyes met across the dining hall, something passed between them, an unspoken command, a plan shared without words. And always, you noticed, the cook's hand hovered close to the knives at his belt, as if he was waiting for a moment that only he and Krauss understood. The men kept working, felling spruce and pine, dragging heavy sledges to the frozen river, convincing themselves that spring would come soon enough. Yet beneath their songs and curses, you could feel it. Death was already walking among you, cloaked in frost and hunger, biding its time. Then came the first real accident, at least. That's what they called it. A young logger named Otto was crushed beneath a fallen trunk. His friends swore the cut had been clean, the wedges properly placed, the rope steady, yet somehow the tree fell wrong, trapping him beneath its weight. He died before anyone could lift it. Krauss ordered his body carried away without ceremony, and Madsen rang the supper bell before the men had even wiped the blood from their hands. That night, as the men chewed on a stew thicker and richer than any you had eaten since the journey began, you felt a strange taste spread across your tongue, metallic, faintly sweet, as if the snow outside had melted in your mouth and left behind rust. You set your spoon down, watching Madsen's steady movements as he ladled second helpings with a practiced smile. None of the others said a word, though more than one pair of eyes flickered toward the cook's knives hanging on the wall. In White Peak Camp, silence was survival. Yet silence you realized, could also be complicity. The night the first murder revealed itself, you were already awake. The wind rattled the cabin walls like a warning, and the stoves had long since burned down to embers. Most of the men were asleep, their breaths uneven in the cold. But you lay still, listening. Somewhere beyond the logs and snow, a sound threaded its way into your ears, too deliberate to be wind, too steady to be the creak of wood. Footsteps. You slipped on your coat and boots, heart heavy, and followed the sound. The snow outside reflected the lantern glow from the foreman's cabin, a pale and flickering halo. There, hunched near the supply shed, you caught a glimpse of Madsen's figure. He moved with purpose, shoulders bent, apron tied even in the dead of night. Something dragged behind him, leaving a furrow in the snow like the trail of a wounded beast. The next morning, a death was announced in an accident, as Krauss called it. A man named Eric, one of the stronger loggers, was said to have slipped on ice while hauling timber, crushing his skull against a sled runner. Krauss stood before the men with his arms folded, voice sharp and final. No one was to question it. Work would continue, and Eric's name would be struck from the ledger. But you had seen more. You had seen the way the body was brought back, not by sled, but by men whose faces were pale, eyes fixed on the snow as though afraid to look down. You saw how Eric's blood had already stiffened into dark ice, though the sun had not yet risen. And most of all, you saw Krauss gesture toward Madsen, the two exchanging a glance that lasted longer than any words. That night, the cookhouse was full. Madsen served bowls of stew, steaming rich and thick, the kind of meal the camp had not seen in weeks. The men ate with abandon, too hungry to question the sudden abundance. Yet you, spoon halfway to your lips, caught the scent of iron. The flavor on your tongue was not the familiar salt of pork or the earthy tang of turnips, but something deeper, coppery, unmistakable. You swallowed, your throat tight, and set the bowl aside. Around you, laughter rose, men slapping each other's backs as though life had returned to the camp. But behind every smile, you could see the shadow of ignorance, or perhaps willful blindness. The stew kept them alive. But at what cost? In the days that followed, the story of Eric's death unraveled in whispers. Some swore they had seen his body being dragged, not carried, to the riverbank before it disappeared. Others claimed the blood near the sled had been brushed away, snow-packed deliberately to cover the stains. No one dared speak these things aloud when Krauss was near. The foreman's silence was louder than any threat. You began writing. In a battered notebook tucked beneath your mattress, you recorded every detail: the missing supplies, the strange tastes in the food, the men who vanished with no trace. Each entry felt like a lifeline, proof that you were not imagining what you saw. If death claimed you next, someone might find your words, might piece together the truth. One evening, you returned late from the tree line, your boots heavy with ice. The camp was quiet, too quiet, and the smell of stew hung thick in the air. You entered the cookhouse just as Madsen was wiping down his knives, their blades polished to a sheen that caught the lantern light. He looked up at you, and for a moment, his eyes held yours calm, steady, as though he knew exactly what you suspected. Then he smiled, the same thin curve of lips that never reached his eyes, and asked if you were hungry. The following week, another accident struck. A man named Lars vanished during night patrol. His partner claimed he had gone to check the tree line and never returned. No tracks were found. No cry for help echoed through the snow. The next morning, however, Madsen served a stew richer than ever. Meat tender, broth thick. The men ate in silence this time, some glancing at the empty bunk, others staring into their bowls as if answers might rise from the surface. You could feel the camp shifting. Fear no longer whispered at the edges but pressed into every conversation, every glance toward Krauss or Madsen. The men avoided walking alone, huddled closer at night, but still, no one dared confront the truth. Hunger was a sharper blade than suspicion. One night, while tending the dying fire in your cabin, you noticed a ledger on Krauss's desk. Its pages were neat, the columns precise, but here and there, faint erasures marred the ink. Next to Eric's name, the word accident stood stark, but beneath it, barely visible. A set of numbers had once been written weights, perhaps, or measures. You flipped further, finding similar notations erased beside the names of men long gone. It was not just a record of labor, but of something else entirely. That same night, you awoke to screams. By the time you reached the yard, the sound had ceased, replaced by the hiss of wind. A body lay near the sleds, throat torn open, chest hollowed with a precision no beast could manage. Krauss arrived moments later, his voice commanding, calling it another accident. Yet even in the dim lantern light, you saw Madsen at the edge of the crowd, apron already tied, hands steady, eyes cold. The men obeyed, burying the body in the frozen earth. Snow drifted over the grave within hours, as though the land itself wished to erase the memory. But you knew it was no accident, no misstep. The deaths were not random. They were chosen, orchestrated, concealed beneath the silence of White Peak Camp. And with every bowl of stew, every erased entry in the ledger, you felt the circle tightening. If hunger was the weapon, then each man here was nothing more than rations waiting their turn. The camp changed after that second death. Fear became a living thing, curling in the corners of cabins, clinging to the steam rising from bowls of food. Men spoke less, ate quickly, and looked over their shoulders even in broad daylight. White Peak Camp no longer felt like a place of labor. It had become a waiting room for the inevitable. It began with the disappearances, one by one. Men simply did not return from their shifts. A pair of loggers, Johann and Matthias, failed to come back from the river where they had been hauling frozen timber. Krauss declared that the ice had given way, swallowing them whole, though no cracks were found. Another man, Thomas, never woke from his bunk. His bed was empty in the morning, his possessions left behind, as though he had dissolved into the night itself. each loss was written into the ledger, neat and clinical. Beside the names, words like accident or lost replaced the truth. The columns continued in tidy rows, the foreman's handwriting precise, as if order could contain the chaos consuming the camp. But you noticed the erasures again, faint impressions of numbers beneath the ink. They reminded you of butcher's notes, weights of meat, tallies of livestock. The men whispered when Krauss was not near. Some spoke of wolves or bears, beasts driven mad by hunger. Others muttered about curses, about the land itself rejecting intruders. A few even wondered aloud if the forest had swallowed their comrades whole. But none dared speak the simplest truth, that it was not nature, nor spirits, but men. Men among them who orchestrated the vanishings. You began to watch Madsen more closely. He moved through the camp like a shadow, his apron tied even when no meal was being cooked. His knives were always sharp, the blades glinting whenever lantern light struck them. And though his hands seemed steady, you noticed how often he lingered by the bunkhouse doors at night, as if counting, as if choosing. The meals grew richer as the bodies vanished. What began as thin broth and stale bread became hearty stews, thick cuts of meat, even smoked strips hung above the fire. The men devoured it all, some too hungry to care, others too frightened to ask. You tasted the same metallic tang each time, that copper edge which clung to your tongue long after the bowl was empty. It was no longer a suspicion, it was certainty. Your notebook filled quickly. Each disappearance, each detail, you recorded by lantern light with numb fingers. The entries became more frantic as the patterns emerged. The vanishings occurred in threes, spaced roughly a week apart. Each time, Krauss's ledger reflected the losses with cold efficiency. Each time, Madsen served meals more plentiful than the dwindling supplies should allow. One night, as snow hammered the camp, you found yourself awake again. The fire had burned low, the men around you asleep, and outside, you heard movement. Careful not to stir the others, you crept to the window. Through the frost-clouded glass, you saw figures in the yard, Krauss and Madsen, dragging something between them, a body. You slipped outside, the cold biting into your skin. The two men carried the body toward the supply shed, lantern swinging, shadows stretching across the snow. You followed at a distance, crouching low behind the timber piles. When they opened the shed door, light spilled into the storm, and you saw enough to freeze you in place. Inside, hooks lined the walls. Hooks meant for game, for carcasses, but on them hung men, stripped and cleaned like animals. Their faces slack, eyes wide with a terror that would never fade. The air reeked of blood, iron sharp and overwhelming. Krauss lifted the body they carried onto an empty hook, while Madsen's knife gleamed as he worked with calm precision. You staggered back, nearly slipping in the snow, heart pounding in your ears. The truth was no longer hidden. It was displayed openly, a grotesque pantry of flesh. The camp was not merely a place of labor, it was a slaughterhouse, and the men its stock. The next day, 3 more bunks were empty. No explanation was offered. The men noticed, of course, but no one dared to confront Krauss. He walked among them with the authority of command, his silence an unspoken threat, and Madsen, always nearby, polished his knives, the scrape of steel against stone echoing like a warning. Panic grew, but so did denial. Some men convinced themselves that the missing had deserted, fleeing into the forest in a desperate bid for survival. Others told themselves the food was still safe, that it came from the supplies hidden deep in the foreman's stores. But the truth gnawed at you with every bite, every glance at the ledger, every sound of sharpening steel. When another patrol vanished, 3 men this time, you realized the order was not random. The names in the ledger aligned with the bunk rows, moving systematically, one after the other. It was not chaos, but calculation. The deaths were organized, a methodical thinning of numbers. You tried to warn others. Henrik listened, his eyes dark with fear, but shook his head. "What choice do we have?" he whispered. "Starve, freeze. At least this way. Some of us live. Others refuse to hear you, muttering that you were losing your mind. Yet in their silence, in the way they avoided your gaze, you saw the truth they already knew. One night, you found Henrik gone too. His bunk was stripped bare, the mattress cold. In the cookhouse the next day, the stew was thicker than ever. The circle was closing. You saw your own name in the ledger, faintly etched, then erased, then written again. A premonition, a sentence awaiting its turn. No matter how tightly you clutched your notebook, no matter how carefully you hid your words, you knew it was only a matter of time before silence would claim you as well, and still, the meals continued. The investigation, if one could even call it that, was doomed from the start. In White Peak Camp, the men tasked with finding answers were the same ones erasing them. Krauss controlled every scrap of information, every entry in the ledger, every statement that left the camp. And yet, despite his grip on silence, cracks began to show. You noticed them first in the eyes of the survivors, the ones who could no longer swallow Madsen's stew without trembling. By the time 30 men had vanished, word spread beyond the camp. When supply wagons finally broke through the snow-choked passes, rumors of death traveled with them. The company in charge of White Peak sent 2 men to inspect. Though they were not policemen, merely clerks with pens and ink, they stayed only a single night. Their questions met with Krauss's curt replies and Madsen's unnerving stare. The next morning, their ledgers were signed, their pockets heavier, and their silence assured. They left without stepping into the forest, without speaking to any of the men who had seen their comrades disappear. But you had your notebook. In its pages, the truth was scrawled in ink and frost-bitten fingerprints. You documented the numbers Krauss tried to erase, the smells and textures of the meals that grew suspiciously rich, the names of the missing. You even recorded the sound of Madsen's blade against the whetstone, a noise that seemed to grow louder with each disappearance. Still, fear ruled you. Each time you thought of slipping your journal to the supply men, of begging them to take it down the mountain, the image of Krauss's eyes stopped you, cold, calculating, merciless. If he discovered your writings, you would not vanish quietly. You would be made an example. Hung like game in that shed you could no longer pass without shuddering. The camp began to eat itself in more ways than one. Distrust gnawed at the survivors. Men whispered about who might be next, who might already be complicit. Some accused each other of aiding Krauss, of serving as lookouts for Madsen in exchange for survival. Fights broke out in the snow, fists cracking against jaws, boots crunching against ribs. Yet these brawls were quickly silenced. Krauss appeared, and with a single order, the camp fell into obedience again. His control was absolute until it wasn't. It started with a boy, no more than 16, who had lied about his age to join the company. His name was Emil, and he had a way of staring into the fire as though the flames spoke secrets only he could hear. One night, Emil approached you in the dark, eyes wide. He said he had seen Krauss and Madsen hauling another body into the shed. And worse, he had seen the ledger. He swore he had glimpsed more than names and numbers. He claimed there were instructions written in code. Diagrams of the human body, marked with precise measurements, cuts, and weights. You urged him to keep silent, but the boy was reckless. The next morning, he confronted Krauss in the yard, his voice cracking as he demanded to know what was happening to the missing men. For a moment, the camp held its breath. Krauss's expression never changed. He dismissed Emil with a wave of his hand, ordered the men back to work, and the day continued as if nothing had happened. That night, Emil was gone. His bunk lay empty, his boots still beneath it. The next day's stew was the richest yet. The others pretended not to notice, but you saw the way their hand shook as they lifted spoons to their mouths. Some muttered prayers before eating. Others simply closed their eyes, swallowing with grim determination. Survival demanded silence, and silence demanded complicity. Weeks passed, the snow piling higher, the cold sinking deeper. By now, fewer than half of the original 87 remained. You began to hear voices not from the men, but from the forest itself. In the howling of the wind, you swore you heard names, fragments of screams, echoes of those who had vanished. Sometimes, lying awake in the cabin, you heard footsteps pacing outside your door, followed by a whisper just beyond hearing. Whether it was madness or the voices of the dead, you no longer knew. One night, unable to bear the weight of silence, you crept toward the shed again. The door was ajar, lantern light spilling out. Inside, Madsen worked alone, his blade moving in steady arcs. The body on the hook was fresh, its skin pale against the dark wood. You watched as he carved with a surgeon's precision, separating muscle from bone, placing each cut of flesh into labeled bins. It was not butchery born of desperation, but a system, a practice refined over years. Then you saw it, a stack of notebooks, thicker and older than your own, lying on a shelf near the wall. You inched closer, breath shallow, and caught a glimpse of the pages, drawings of bodies, lists of weights, notes on flavor, texture, preservation. These were not the ramblings of madness, but a manual, a record of consumption, cataloged with scientific detachment. White Peak Camp was no accident, no sudden descent into savagery. It was part of something larger, something organized. A noise behind you broke your trance. Madsen's knife stilled, his head turning slowly. You fled into the storm before he could see your face. Snow swallowing your tracks as you stumbled back to your cabin. All night, you lay awake, clutching your notebook, waiting for the door to open, for the knife to find your throat. But dawn came, and you were still alive. The next day, a patrol of 3 men vanished, and in the ledger, you saw it again. Your name, faintly penciled, then erased, then penciled again. It was no longer a question of if, it was when. The truth arrived not with a scream, but with a whisper. By the time the snow began to soften, when daylight lingered a little longer on the skeletal pines, White Peak Camp was no longer a camp, but a cage. Barely 24 of the original 87 remained, and among them, trust had rotted away. Men slept with axes under their bunks, spoons clenched in fists, eyes darting whenever the cook's ladle hovered too long over their bowl. It was then that you stumbled upon the deeper truth. You had broken into the foreman's quarters while Krauss patrolled the yard, pretending to inspect sledges. The lock was simple, the door swollen with frost, but the weight of what lay inside nearly crushed you. Beneath his bed, wrapped in oilskin, lay a leather-bound book. Not the neat ledgers of timber and rations, but something else. The pages were filled with dates stretching back years, camp names scrawled in ink, each followed by lists of men, columns marked useful, tough, tender, and at the bottom of each page, totals. Not of logs, but of weight, human weight. The blood in your veins turned to ice. White Peak was not the first. It was not an accident, not even the product of desperation. It was a continuation of something older, colder, and far more deliberate. Krauss had done this before. Dozens of camps, hundreds of men. Every record buried beneath snow and silence. You closed the book, hands trembling, and nearly missed the folded papers tucked into its back. These were letters, correspondence stamped with the seal of the company itself. Instructions written in a careful, polite script. Ensure survival through any means necessary. Resourcefulness will be rewarded. Flesh does not spoil in cold. The company knew. The thought gnawed at you as you tucked the book beneath your coat. It was not Krauss alone, not Madsen alone. They were pieces in a machine larger than the forest, larger than this winter. Men were not workers here. They were commodities, measured and consumed under the guise of progress. That night, you shared your discovery with only one man, Tobias, a logger who had long since stopped eating stew. He had grown gaunt, cheeks hollow, eyes sunken but sharp. He listened as you described the ledgers, the letters, the company seal, his jaw clenched. But he did not speak until you were finished. "It means," he whispered, "we were never meant to leave." The words hung between you like frost. From then on, you both watched closely. You saw how Krauss carried himself with an authority that went beyond the camp, as if he knew he would never face judgment. You saw how Madsen's hands never shook, his knife never faltered, as though his role had been honed by practice in other places, other winters. And you saw the way the men avoided the truth, preferring hunger for answers to hunger in their bellies. The circle tightened again. Another 3 vanished. Tobias muttered that the order was deliberate, that the bunk rows were being crossed off like lines on a map. Soon it would be you. Soon it would be him. Then came the night of the fire. A blaze erupted in the supply shed, smoke curling against the pale sky. Men rushed with buckets, shoveling snow onto the flames. But inside, the truth revealed itself. The hooks where bodies had hung were blackened, charred shapes twisting in the smoke. The notebooks, Madsen's careful manuals, were reduced to ash. And in the chaos, you saw Krauss standing apart, his face unreadable, while Madsen howled with fury, clutching a single salvaged knife to his chest like a holy relic. Someone had betrayed them. Someone had dared to strike at the heart of their system. And you knew the price of such defiance. The next morning, one of the overseers, Jonas, a man loyal to Krauss, was found hanging from the timber frame, throat slit ear to ear. His death was declared a punishment, a sacrifice, a warning. His name was scratched violently from the ledger, but scrawled beneath it, in Krauss's own hand, were other names. Yours, Tobias's. It was no longer survival. It was execution. You and Tobias planned to flee, to escape the camp before your turn came. The forest was vast, the snow unrelenting, but anything was better than staying. You packed what little you could, your notebook, a flask of water, scraps of bread hidden beneath your bunk. That night, you waited until the camp quieted, until the wind rose to cover your footsteps. But as you reached the edge of the tree line, a voice called your name. Not Krauss's, not Madsen's, a voice low, broken, familiar. You turned and saw Emil, the boy you thought gone, standing in the shadows. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. But he was alive, or something like it. He whispered that he had not been killed, but kept alive, experimented on. Madsen had written his weight in 3 columns, cutting pieces of him slowly, feeding him scraps of himself. His words faltered, his body swaying, and you saw the stitches along his arms, his legs, his chest, not healed, but bound together like butcher's work. You stumbled back, bile rising in your throat. Tobias pulled you away. But Emil's last words followed you into the night. It never ends. We are only one camp of many. The forest swallowed his voice as he collapsed in the snow. You could not go back for him. You could only run. And as you did, you realized the greatest horror was not the deaths, nor the meals, nor the ledger. It was the system, the endless cycle hidden beneath the guise of industry, where flesh was just another resource to be measured, consumed, and forgotten. White Peak Camp was not the anomaly. It was the blueprint. You and Tobias fled through the forest, every step breaking the silence that seemed older than the trees themselves. The snow clawed at your legs. The cold gnawed at your lungs. And behind you, the camp smoldered in your memory. White Peak was gone, or at least what it had been, but the truth clung to you heavier than the frost. Days blurred together. Hunger sharpened every sound, and fear became your only fire. At night, you woke to the snap of branches, certain that Krauss or Madsen or worse. The echoes of the men they had butchered were following close behind. Tobias muttered in his sleep, clutching his axe as though it were the last tether to sanity. Eventually, you stumbled upon a trapper's cabin, its roof sagging beneath decades of snow. Inside, warmth returned, but so did the memories. You opened your notebook, hands trembling, and flipped through the pages you had filled with names, weights, disappearances. Every mark was proof. Every sentence was a scar. But as you read, something strange revealed itself. The handwriting in certain places was not yours. Notes had appeared in the margin sketches of bodies, corrections to your numbers, additions you could not remember writing. It was as if the ledger itself had followed you. Tobias left one morning to check the tree line and never returned. No tracks led away from the cabin. His axe leaned against the wall, frost clinging to its blade, as though he had never touched it. Alone. You realized escape was a lie. The forest might let you leave, but the truth would never release you. When spring thawed the mountains, you made it back to civilization. Your body survived, but the world no longer felt solid. You sent word to the authorities, begged them to investigate, but your pleas were met with silence. The company's ledgers showed nothing but timber counts, production yields, and wages. No mention of White Peak. No mention of the 87 who had marched in. You buried your notebook deep beneath the floorboards of your new home, swearing never to open it again. Yet at night, you still hear the scratch of a pen, the rasp of steel against stone, the bubbling of a stew you will never eat. Sometimes, when you close your eyes, you see the names written faintly in pencil. Your name, written and erased, written and erased. And now, as you sit in the safety of your house, you feel the question pressing in, heavier than the snow ever was. What if White Peak was not the last? What if the ledger is still being kept, and the next name written is yours? So tell me, if you were in that camp, would you eat to survive, or would you starve with the truth? Comment below, because silence can be just as deadly as the knife. And remember, subscribe if you dare, because the next story might already have your name in it. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that has lived far too long in whispered legends and brittle parish records. The year is 1891, and a cellar door groans open beneath the stone belly of St. Bartholomew's School in New England. Oil lamps flicker against wet walls, casting uneven halos on the faces of police officers and a trembling priest. The air is foul with rot, yet it is not the smell that makes them falter. It is the sight. Rows of small bodies sit upright along the wall, their faces sewn into crude smiles, their hands folded as if in prayer. Thread bites through pale flesh where eyelids have been stitched shut. Each child is dressed in scraps of the school's uniform. Though the fabric is stiff with dried blood, they look less like corpses and more like puppets abandoned after some macabre performance. The silence inside the chamber is so complete that the men hear their own pulses thundering in their ears. One officer retches into his sleeve. The priest clutches his crucifix, muttering words of deliverance. Yet his hands shake so badly that the cross swings like a pendulum. Someone whispers they've been arranged. Someone placed them here. Like offerings, no one answers, because the truth is already written across every horrified face. A notebook is found on a wooden crate, its pages crowded with childish handwriting. Beneath sketches of angels and bleeding lambs are lists of names of the missing boys, everyone crossed out. The final page reads, "Now they can stay with me forever." The question that echoes louder than prayers, louder than the storm beating against the chapel above, is the one that will never truly fade. Who could do such a thing in a house of God? St. Bartholomew's School for Boys stood alone at the edge of the Massachusetts woods, its bell tower catching the weak light of the winter sun. The building was both sanctuary and prison, a religious boarding school where faith was enforced with discipline, and where silence was prized above laughter. Inside its stone corridors, voices echoed as if carried through catacombs, and the draft of the sea crept under the doors, even in the heart of New England. The year was 1891, but the school felt older, timeless in its gloom. The boys who lived within its walls came from two worlds. Some were the sons of wealth, sent away by fathers too busy to raise them and mothers too delicate to be burdened. Others were orphans, plucked from poorhouses or left at the gates like unwanted parcels. These children shared the same dormitories, recited the same prayers, and endured the same rigid routine. Dawn began with the toll of the chapel bell, followed by Mass in the cold nave where incense failed to mask the damp odor of stone. Meals were plain and silent, the only sound the scrape of spoons on tin bowls. Among these boys was Elias Finch. His arrival had been marked by whispers from the start. No one claimed him. No papers accompanied him. Only a rosary clutched so tightly in his hand that the beads had left bruises in his palm. The brothers of the order accepted him as an act of charity, but charity did not extend to warmth. Elias grew up under watchful eyes that regarded him less as a pupil than as a soul in need of correction. Elias was not like the others. He was slight, with dark hair that hung across his forehead, and he rarely spoke unless pressed. His silence made him conspicuous in a place where recitation and prayer were constant demands. When he did speak, it was often a passage from Scripture, though chosen with unsettling precision lines about blood, sacrifice, or forsaken children. The other boys mocked him for this, until they realized their taunts stirred nothing in him. He simply stared, unblinking, as if memorizing their faces for some later use. The priests noted his stillness during lessons, his refusal to squirm like the others. Yet they also noticed where his eyes wandered to the crucifixes with their carved wounds, to the illustrations of saints pierced by arrows or burned alive. One brother caught him once in the chapel after midnight, tracing the lines of a painting depicting Saint Sebastian's bleeding torso. Elias had whispered, "He looks peaceful," before being dragged back to bed. His strangeness deepened as the years passed. While others sought games in the courtyard or warmth by the fire, Elias drifted to the school's forgotten places. The disused wine cellar, sealed long ago, seemed to call to him more often. He lingered near the small mortuary chamber where the brothers kept bodies awaiting burial. There, he would sit cross-legged, gazing at the shrouded forms, lips moving soundlessly. Once, when asked why he preferred the company of corpses, he said simply, "They do not lie." Rumors spread quickly among the boys. Some swore they had seen him standing by their beds in the night, watching. Others whispered that he never closed his eyes, that he wandered after curfew with a candle stub, muttering to himself in Latin. Fear made them superstitious. They began crossing themselves when he entered a room and dared each other not to sit near him during meals. The school punished superstition harshly, yet no lashings could erase the unease Elias inspired. Daily life at St. Bartholomew's revolved around devotion and obedience. Boys copied scripture until their fingers cramped, marched in strict lines to lessons, and scrubbed floors until they shone. But for Elias, devotion took another shape. He copied images of crucifixions and martyrs in the margins of his books. He carved small figures out of candle wax, crude little bodies with crossed arms, which he kept hidden beneath his mattress. When discovered, a priest burned them, calling them blasphemy. Elias only shrugged, and later began making more. It was not only death that fascinated him, it was preservation. He seemed to dread abandonment more than punishment. Other boys feared the strap or the rod. Elias feared being forgotten. He clung to objects, others discarded a broken shoe buckle, a strand of hair from the dormitory floor, scraps of cloth from torn uniforms. These he hoarded in a small wooden box, which he guarded with unusual ferocity. The priests attempted to guide him through confession, through lectures on obedience, through punishments meant to break his habits, yet they failed to understand the depth of his loneliness, the way he had grown up without a name to call his own, without arms to hold him. Every discipline only hardened him further. He became convinced that if he could hold on to pieces of others' objects, mementos, remnants, then he would never again face the void of being left behind. By the winter of 1891, Elias was 15. The other boys had learned to keep their distance, yet he remained always near, watching. His presence was a shadow that grew longer with each passing week. In a school where prayers filled every corner, Elias Finch embodied a silence that even faith could not soothe. The teachers dismissed it as melancholy. The students whispered it was something else, something darker, waiting in the depths of St. Bartholomew's, where the cellar door still groaned under its lock. The night Jonathan Hale disappeared began like every other at St. Bartholomew's. The chapel bell tolled, its hollow sound rolling through the corridors and pulling the boys from their dormitories like cattle driven toward ritual. Snow battered the stained glass windows, muffling the world beyond the stone walls, while within, 100 voices rose in prayer. The scent of incense fought with the mildew that clung stubbornly to the pews. Jonathan knelt in the second row, his shoulders hunched, as if he wished to fold himself small enough to vanish between the cracks in the floor. He was a quiet boy of 12, flaxen-haired, slight in build, neither cruel nor kind enough to leave a mark among his peers. He mouthed the Latin responses with a nervous haste, as though he feared to stumble. His thin hands trembled against the wooden rail. A priest's voice thundered at the altar, but Jonathan's gaze wandered. It flicked toward the shadowed edges of the chapel where Elias Finch sat apart, his dark eyes fixed on something beyond the crucifix, beyond the stone fixed, it seemed, on him. The hymn began. Boys rose as one, their voices echoing against the high vaults. But where Jonathan had knelt, there was only empty wood. At first, the absence drew no notice. Perhaps he had slipped out, lightheaded from fasting, perhaps excused himself. Only later, when the roll was called in the dormitory, did the hollow space he left behind harden into terror. The prefect's voice rang out. Steady at first. Jonathan Hale. Silence. Again. Louder, Jonathan Hale. Beds creaked. Boys shifted, glancing at the empty cot. Jonathan's trunk lay untouched, his shoes neatly placed beneath, his books stacked with care. There was no sign of departure, only absence. The priests searched by lantern light. They swept through kitchens, refectories, even the freezing stables. The courtyard snow remained smooth, unmarred by footsteps. The headmaster frowned at the impossibility of it, and by morning announced the official tale. A note, produced from his desk, claimed Jonathan had fled the school. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the words insisting he longed for home. It was read aloud during Mass. The boys exchanged furtive glances. Jonathan's family lived 200 miles away in Connecticut. He had no funds, no provisions, no warm coat beyond the one issued by the school. His belongings remained in his trunk. The explanation did not hold. Yet it was treated as gospel by the priests. To question it was to doubt authority. Still, whispers began. Some swore they had seen him after prayers. A pale figure ushered through a side corridor. The one leading him was Elias Finch, his hand gripping Jonathan's elbow, guiding him toward the stairwell that ended in a locked cellar door. Those who spoke of it lowered their voices to whispers beneath blankets, for to accuse another boy without proof invited lashes. And who would believe them if the priests had already chosen their truth? Fear blossomed like mold in the dark. The dormitory grew restless. Boys woke at night to faint sounds, a scraping, the slow pull of thread through cloth, the muted hum of a lullaby carried on the pipes. Some claimed they heard Jonathan's voice in prayer, distant, as though muffled behind stone. Others felt the weight of eyes watching them while they slept, only to find Elias awake, staring, unmoving. When asked directly about Jonathan, Elias tilted his head and answered with a calm that chilled the marrow. He is still with us. He just doesn't sit where you expect. The word spread quickly. Even the priests, though dismissive, could not entirely mask their unease. One brother struck Elias across the face for his insolence, but Elias did not flinch. He only smiled faintly, a private curve of lips, as though amused at some secret joke. The days moved on, but Jonathan's absence gnawed at every moment. His empty desk in the classroom drew eyes away from the blackboard. His untouched cup at the dining table seemed to accuse in silence. The priests urged the boys to pray for Jonathan's safe return, yet their own voices trembled on certain syllables. Routine resumed lessons, scripture, chores, but beneath it all was the cellar door. It loomed in every imagination. Boys dared one another to approach it, to press an ear against its heavy wood. A few claimed they had, and what they heard was worse than silence: soft thuds, the stretch of fabric, the low murmur of a boy's voice repeating prayers out of sync, as though his mouth were sewn half shut. Sleep became torment. The bravest feigned indifference by day, but wept at night when shadows shifted. Candle flames guttered inexplicably, plunging rooms into darkness. The chapel bell, unmoved, rang once in the black hours before dawn. The priests scolded the boys for weakness, for allowing fancy to overtake faith, but even they crossed themselves more frequently, as though fighting off unseen blasphemies. Elias carried himself differently now. His silences seemed intentional, weighted. He sketched crude figures in the margins of his notebooks, children kneeling, hands folded, mouths marked with stitches. When confronted, he murmured, "Prayers last longer if the mouths are closed." He hoarded scraps, broken buckles, torn cloth, even strands of hair plucked from the dormitory floor. He kept them in a box beneath his bed, guarded with feral intensity. The boys avoided him, yet his presence filled every space. He sat apart in the chapel, always at the edge of light, eyes fixed on the crucifix with a hunger that unsettled even the priests. At meals, he ate little, but his gaze lingered too long on the others, as if memorizing their faces. No one wished to sit beside him, yet no one dared refuse if assigned. Weeks passed, and Jonathan was never found. His name was spoken less often, not because it was forgotten, but because it carried a weight of dread. To say it aloud was to invite something into the room. The priest pretended the matter closed, but the boys felt the change. St. Bartholomew's was no longer sanctuary. It had become a labyrinth of locked doors and swallowed voices, a place where disappearance could happen between one prayer and the next. And still, from deep beneath the chapel, came the faint sound of thread pulled through flesh, the careful work of hands reshaping silence into something that endured. The disappearance of Jonathan Hale had left a wound in St. Bartholomew's, but by the time the second boy vanished, the wound had festered into something darker. Matthew Doyle, a sturdy child with a quick laugh, was last seen in the study hall, his slate covered in half-finished sums. He had left behind his books, his boots, and even his winter cloak. The priests again declared he had fled into the night, yet no footprints marked the snow. For the boys, the truth was clearer. Matthew had gone the same way as Jonathan, swallowed by the stone belly of the school. Rumors spread faster than prayers. Some claimed Elias Finch had been the last to see Matthew, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder, his eyes glinting with a strange hunger. Others whispered that Elias had whispered something in Matthew's ear during evening lessons, after which Matthew seemed dazed, as if hypnotized. When questioned, Elias merely said he was lonely. I offered him company. The priests punished him for insolence. Yet they, too, avoided his gaze afterward. Then it was William Price. He vanished during morning chores, the mop he had been using still wet, the bucket overturned on the stone floor. Weeks later, another boy, Samuel Kerr, failed to return from the lavatory. Each disappearance was spaced by only a few weeks, never close enough to cause full panic, yet always near enough to ensure no one forgot. The boys began to keep a grim tally among themselves. 4 gone, then 5, then 6. Each one erased as neatly as chalk wiped from a slate. At night, the sounds began. At first faint, the scrape of metal against wood, the tug of thread through cloth. Some boys pressed their ears to the dormitory floor and swore they heard voices, muffled but pleading. Others claimed to hear lullabies tuneless, haunting, sung by someone whose voice cracked like a child's. There were nights when sudden laughter, high-pitched and multiplied, drifted up through the cracks. It lasted only a moment before silence fell again, but the echoes clung to every dream. The priests explained these accounts away as fancy, the fevered imagination of boys unused to hardship. But their authority was fraying. Candles snuffed themselves without draft. Doors slammed on their own. The chapel bell swung once at midnight with no hand upon the rope. The boys prayed more fervently, though not from faith, but fear. Each prayer was an incantation against the creeping certainty that something beneath them was alive. Elias's strangeness deepened. He no longer ate with the others, slipping bread and meat into his pockets. Scraps of cloth, broken buckles, even strands of hair vanished from dormitory floors, only to be found in a wooden box beneath his bed. His notebooks filled with grotesque sketches, children with mouths sewn shut, eyes stitched into crude crosses, bodies kneeling in eternal prayer. When one priest demanded to know the meaning, Elias whispered prayers last longer when they cannot escape. The boys avoided him whenever possible. They invented rules meant to protect them. Never follow Elias after curfew. Never sit too close during meals. Never meet his eyes for too long. Yet the rules provided no safety. Some boys woke to find Elias standing beside their beds, staring silently down at them. Others felt his presence in the chapel, his gaze pressing against their backs as they knelt. He seemed to grow stronger as others grew weaker, as if each disappearance fed something within him. By winter's heart, the fear was absolute. No one walked the corridors alone. Boys clutched crucifixes beneath their tunics, whispering prayers whenever footsteps echoed behind them. The priests, desperate to preserve the school's reputation, silenced every report. They punished boys who spoke Jonathan's name aloud, insisting he and the others had abandoned their faith and fled into sin. Yet in their private moments, even the priests crossed themselves more often, their hands trembling as they did so. The breaking point came during a storm. Snow battered the walls, winds howled down the chimneys, and the boys huddled in their beds, sleepless. That night, the noises from below grew louder than ever before. The scrape of a chair dragged across stone, the thud of something heavy dropped. And then the unmistakable sound of children giggling, joined by the creak of a lullaby hummed in Elias's flat, tuneless voice. The boys clamped hands over their ears, but the sound seeped through their bones. The next morning, another bed lay empty, another name uncalled. The priests offered the same weary explanation, but no one believed. The tally climbed higher. Elias moved through the school with a strange calm, as though surrounded by unseen companions. He murmured to himself constantly, his lips shaping words like conversations. When asked who he spoke to, he replied, "To my friends. They stay with me now. They will not leave." By then, Elias Finch was no longer merely a boy. He was the shadow cast over St. Bartholomew's, the figure the others circled around in terror. The school had become his hunting ground, its silence broken only by the steady rhythm of vanishings. Every creak of the cellar door, every hum in the night, reminded the boys that no one was safe. And worst of all was the sense, unspoken yet undeniable, that nothing, neither priests nor prayers, could stop him. St. Bartholomew's was no longer a place of education or sanctuary. It was a trap. And in its heart, Elias stitched and sewed and sang, fashioning something in the dark that only he could see. The winter of 1891 settled heavily over St. Bartholomew's. Snow piled against the walls until the windows became narrow slots of gray light, and the air within the school was so cold that boys' breath hung in pale clouds above their desks. Yet the chill was nothing compared to the dread that soaked every hallway. The disappearances had become a pattern no one could ignore. By January, half a dozen boys had vanished, their belongings untouched, their names spoken only in whispers. For the priests, denial had become policy. They told the parents that their sons had run away in weakness and wrote letters full of reassurances. Each disappearance was covered with a sermon about temptation and the dangers of disobedience. Behind closed doors, however, the brothers quarreled. The headmaster insisted upon silence. Fearing scandal, the younger priests muttered prayers against evil, while the oldest shook their heads, knowing too well that silence was already complicity. The townsfolk noticed as well. Rumors spread beyond the gates, and though the priests tried to contain them, the gossip of servants and tradesmen carried whispers to the village. Men in taverns spoke of St. Bartholomew's as cursed, of children swallowed by its walls. Farmers muttered about strange sounds drifting through the night air. When the wind blew from the east, the faint rhythm of a hymn carried on unseen voices. For the boys inside, the school had become unbearable. Each night was a vigil. Each morning, a lottery of survival. They clung to crucifixes under their pillows, and many began scratching protective symbols into the wood of their beds. Some developed nervous tics, crossing themselves a dozen times before lying down, or refusing to speak aloud for fear their voices would be stolen. And always there was Elias Finch, moving silently among them like a ghost made flesh. He had grown bolder. Once content to mutter alone, he now carried his wooden box openly, the one filled with scraps of cloth and hair, as though daring anyone to take it from him. He slipped away during meals, often returning with the smell of earth clinging to his boots. When asked where he had been, he only smiled and said, "Keeping watch." The priests attempted small investigations of their own. The cellar door, always locked, was inspected. The key hung from the headmaster's belt, untouched. They told themselves nothing lay beneath but mold and old casks, yet several times, boys swore they heard the lock rattle at night, as though turned from within. One brother left a cross nailed to the cellar door, only to find it torn down the next morning, the wood gouged where nails had been. Testimonies emerged, but they contradicted one another. A boy claimed he had seen Elias leading William Price by the hand. Another swore William had gone willingly, following Elias as though entranced. Others said they saw nothing at all. Fear distorted memory, and the priests seized upon the confusion as proof of childish imagination. Punishments were handed out for lying, but each beating only deepened the silence. One night, a boy named Peter awoke screaming. He insisted he had seen Jonathan Hale in the dormitory, sitting upright on the floor, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, lips moving soundlessly. The priests dismissed it as nightmare. Yet other boys admitted they had seen the same figure, pale and stiff, vanish when the lantern was lit. The rumor spread quickly. Jonathan was still in the school, not alive, not dead, but changed. As fear grew, the town began to stir. Parents arrived at the gates demanding answers. The headmaster, sweating under his cassock, assured them their sons were safe. A few children were withdrawn from the school, their trunks carried quickly away in carts. Yet most parents, bound by trust in the church or unable to care for their sons at home, left them behind. The shadow over St. Bartholomew's lengthened. The priests could no longer ignore the signs. Strange marks appeared on the chapel walls, crosses carved backward, symbols no one could identify. Hymnals vanished from the pews, only to be found shredded and scattered in the courtyard. A brother discovered a rosary strung with teeth instead of beads, hidden beneath the altar. He fainted on the spot. At last, the authorities were summoned, though reluctantly. A constable from the nearby town arrived, trudging through the snow with his lantern. He interviewed the priests, who lied smoothly about runaways. He questioned the boys, who said nothing for fear of punishment. Yet the constable lingered uneasily by the cellar door, pressing his ear against the wood. He swore he heard breathing on the other side. When he demanded the key, the headmaster refused, insisting it was only rats. The constable left, unsettled, but with no proof to act. The boys felt abandoned. They had looked to priests, then to parents, then to law, and each had failed them. Their only protection was silence, their only hope to survive unnoticed. Elias thrived in this despair. He wandered the dormitories at night, humming softly, speaking to the shadows as though surrounded by companions, more and more. Boys woke to find him seated at the foot of their beds, watching them with that same faint smile. the school's reputation crumbled. By February, nearly a dozen children had disappeared. Official records still spoke of departures, but the tally scratched secretly into a desk by trembling hands told the truth. Each vanished boy left a mark, and the marks formed a list that grew longer with each week. Supernatural signs began to blur with the natural. Some boys dreamed of hands tugging at their sheets, only to wake and find the sheets gone, stripped neatly from the bed. Others swore they heard chanting in the chapel, long after it had been locked for the night. Once, the bell tower rang 3 slow tolls at midnight, though the rope was still tied at dawn. The priests muttered about temptation, but the boys whispered another word haunting. The investigation was over before it truly began. Authorities had been turned away. Priests hid behind their walls, and the boys knew that the only ones searching for the missing were the missing themselves, wandering the halls as shadows. And at the center of it all was Elias Finch. No longer an odd orphan boy, but a figure of dread, a child whose silence had become a sentence. Every day, another bed was empty. Every night, another voice was heard beneath the floor. And still, the cellar door remained locked, but not empty. The storm that revealed the truth struck in March of 1891. Snow fell so heavily it buried the outer gates, sealing the school off from the world. Winds howled like voices crying through the rafters, and the boys huddled in their beds, too afraid to sleep. That was when one of them, Thomas Bell, gaunt and trembling, slipped away in the night. His courage was born not of bravery, but of terror. He had seen too much, heard too much, and knew if he stayed another night, his name would be the next erased from roll call, barefoot in the freezing dark. Thomas fled across the courtyard. He scaled the outer wall, his hands bleeding from the ice. Hours later, he stumbled into the village, delirious and frostbitten. His words tumbled out in fragments about a cellar, about laughter, about children that were not alive yet, not dead. He spoke of Elias Finch sewing pieces of flesh, of dolls with stitched mouths that whispered prayers through torn lips. The townsfolk, horrified and skeptical in equal measure, summoned the constable once more. This time, he did not come alone. By dawn, a small procession of lawmen and townsmen trudged up the hill to St. Bartholomew's. The storm had not relented, snow slashing sideways in blinding gusts. But still they came. At the gates, the priests tried to block entry, their faces pale with fear. The headmaster declared the accusations nonsense, claiming Thomas Bell was mad with cold and hunger. But the constable demanded the cellar key, his voice unyielding. When the headmaster refused, the men forced the door open themselves. Lanterns cast dim circles of light as they descended. The stone steps groaned under their boots. The air grew damp and foul, and then the smell struck them sweet and putrid, the unmistakable reek of decay. The first lantern illuminated what words could scarcely contain. Children sat upright in neat rows, their hands folded, their heads tilted in mock devotion. Their skin had been crudely sewn with black thread, mouths forced into smiles, eyes stitched shut. Some wore scraps of school uniforms, stiff with dried blood. Their flesh was pale as wax, yet their posture suggested they had been carefully posed, as though frozen in prayer. The cellar was no storage room. It was a chapel of the dead. And there, at the center, was Elias Finch. He sat cross-legged on the floor, a needle in his hand, a child's body laid before him. His dark hair hung over his face as he hummed a lullaby, the sound flat and tuneless. With each stitch, he drew the eyelids closed, pausing only to whisper words too soft to hear. When the lantern light fell upon him, he looked up calmly, as though expecting visitors. "You came late," he said. His voice was soft, almost disappointed. "I wanted them ready before you saw." The men recoiled, some crossing themselves, others gagging at the sight. The constable demanded he drop the needle, but Elias only tilted his head, smiling faintly. Around him, the stitched bodies seemed to glow in the flickering lamplight, their hollow faces reflecting something unholy. The headmaster broke then. He dropped to his knees, sobbing, insisting he had never known. But his protests were drowned out by Elias's words. "They would have left me," Elias whispered, gesturing to the rows of children. "Everyone leaves, but I found a way to keep them. They belong to me now. And to God, they pray without ceasing. They stay forever." The constable stepped forward, hands shaking on his revolver. But even then, Elias did not resist. He set down his needle carefully, folding his hands as though in imitation of his dolls. His eyes glittered with conviction, not madness. "You don't understand," he said. "I saved them from the silence. I saved them from being forgotten. Now, they will never leave, not like I was left." The men dragged him up the stairs, his slight body limp, but his smile never fading. Behind them, the cellar remained, filled with the grotesque congregation of children Elias had remade. The priest, who had first found the scene, fainted outright. Another vomited on the steps. The constable could only whisper, "This isn't a boy. This is something else." The revelation spread through the town like wildfire. Parents arrived, demanding to see their children, only to be met with rows of corpses sewn into prayers. The brothers who had concealed the disappearances faced furious mobs, but the focus always returned to Elias Finch, the boy who had turned St. Bartholomew's into a sanctuary of flesh. What chilled them most was not his crime, but his calm. He never wept, never begged. When questioned, he explained his acts as though they were devotion itself, a holy duty to preserve his companions. To him, it was not murder, it was salvation. By the time he was confined in a cell, the townsfolk had begun to whisper of curses, of demons wearing the faces of boys. But Elias, when asked, spoke only of loyalty. "They are with me still," he said, smiling faintly through the bars. "You may burn the school, you may bury the bodies, but they will not leave me. They will pray with me until the end." The trial of Elias Finch was swift. The townsfolk demanded justice. The parents demanded blood. And the priests, their reputations shattered, said nothing in his defense. Though he was barely 16, the judge declared him old enough to know right from wrong. The verdict was death by hanging. On a cold morning in February 1892, the square filled with villagers. Snow fell in thin flurries, coating the gallows in a pale shroud. Elias was led out in chains, his slight frame swallowed by the coarse prison tunic. Yet he walked without fear, his eyes fixed on something invisible ahead. When the noose was placed around his neck, he turned to the crowd, lips curling in the same faint smile that had unnerved his classmates. "They're still with me," he whispered. "They will always be with me." The trap door opened. His body dropped, twitched, then fell still. But the expression on his face remained serene, almost blissful, as though he had joined his congregation below the earth. The crowd dispersed in uneasy silence. St. Bartholomew's was abandoned within weeks. Parents withdrew their children. Priests resigned or fled. And the school's great stone walls became the haunt of vines and crows. By spring, the windows were broken, the chapel roof sagged, and the cellar door was boarded shut. Yet no one dared tear the place down. It stood for decades, empty, a scar upon the landscape. But the stories did not end. Farmers passing by at night swore they heard children singing in harmony, the sound rising through the boarded windows. Travelers spoke of lights flickering in the tower, though no lantern had been carried there for years, and in the village. Some claimed that on stormy nights you could hear the sound of thread pulled tight, as if someone below was still sewing. Generations passed. The school fell into ruin, its name spoken only in hushed tones. Yet even now, locals warn children not to wander near. For if you press your ear to the ground near the old cellar, you might hear the muffled sound of laughter, thin and distorted, echoing up from beneath the earth. And so the question lingers for you. Listening now, if you heard a knock beneath your floorboards in the dead of night, would you dare to answer? Or would you pray that Elias Finch has not chosen you to join his congregation? Before you dive deeper into stories like this, consider hitting like and subscribing, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with the time and place you're watching, so I know you're still out there.